Joining me now, Darrell West, Vice President and Director of Governance Studies at the Brookings Institution. He is also the author of a new book, Divided Politics, Divided Nation. Philippe and Michael back with me. We have to actually start with the House Judiciary Committee. It's sort of the portrait of divided politics. I mean, moments ago when you're hearing Doug Collins say, this is absolute political theater, I mean, hello? What would you call the president? What would you call a Trump rally? At the end of the day, this report is just about transparency.
It is. And Republicans and Democrats on that committee are acting like the Hatfields and the McCoys. You know, they don't like each other. They see the opponent as the enemy. And it's kind of a sign of how polarized the country has become. We've reached a point where 50% of Republicans now say they would be upset if one of their children married a Democrat. So the polarization is going way beyond politics to affecting social and even family relationships.
You actually write, as often happens in politics, every attempt at a revolution simulates a counter-revolution. Give me an example of this sort of in recent politics that we can point to.
I mean, my book is a 40-year political history, so when you look at each presidency, it seems like we go from one extreme to another. So I think it's no accident we got Donald Trump after the first African-American president. It's quite possible Donald Trump will produce the most progressive president in American history.
All right, well, tribalism, Philippe, has certainly taken over politics. It's taken over the media. But has it taken over America? Because at the end of the day, when you actually speak to people, they're just trying to live their best lives. They don't care about politics. They care about feeding their families, health care, jobs.
I think they do care about politics. They might not just experience it the way we do, sitting around watching MSNBC all day or watching a hearing about a subpoena, but they're feeling it in terms of healthcare being taken away, or their taxes changing, or their taxes being told it'll go down, but in fact they either got nothing or maybe up. So just because someone tangibly doesn't feel the actions of government does not mean they're not seeing it everywhere. And more importantly, I think what Donald Trump is doing to us culturally, to our society, in terms of language with children, in terms of, you know, increased cases of bullying and school and domestic violence, everywhere in the country, people are feeling that. So I think we are more tribal than not. I think if I airdropped into Alabama, I could probably make new friends. But if I touched any of these issues, if I went around saying, hi, I work for Hillary Clinton, I think it'd get tribal awful fast.
Michael?
I think that there are big challenges that our country is facing, whether that's inadequate public education, crumbling infrastructure, need for a strong national defense and a foreign policy that makes sense and fits the 21st century. I don't think that our politics is delivering on the reforms and the changes that we need right now, and I think polarization is a huge part of that. As long as we are channeling ourselves into our separate categories and just talking to people who already agree with us, we're not making progress.
Then what will break that? Because you write that tribalism, tribal discontent reached a boiling point during the 2018 Brett Kavanaugh confirmation. I think we could all agree that absolutely was the case.
Yes, that was just the most recent culture war that we've experienced, and we've seen many of them in recent decades. But I think the polarization also results from a combination of geography and economics. My Metro colleagues at Brookings did a study. They found 15% of American counties now generate 64% of GDP. So what that means is almost all of the economic activities on the East Coast, the West Coast, and a few metropolitan areas in between, most parts of America are being left behind. Those are the people who are really upset and willing to embrace more extreme politicians such as a Donald Trump.
Okay, then if we can all acknowledge that this is the problem, unless you blow up the primary system, how are you even going to address this? Because the whiff of a centrist candidate who's willing to say, let me come together on comprehensive reforms, gets blown out of the system.
Yeah, and I think that there are real things we can do to help the people in the center of the country who feel economically left behind. Rural broadband, more infrastructure, better education, and those are the things that we're not talking about because the president is fixated on the border or this quixotic effort to go after Obamacare again. So we are going to have a big election that is going to determine what the future of our country is and what choices we're going to make.
So you diagnose the problem. Do you see a reasonable solution, especially as we head into an election?
The solution is to address the root causes, which in my view is the lack of economic opportunity, the high cost of education, the geographic disparities.
And who's going to do that? Who has the political will and the money to do that? When GM closes a plant, that's GM's job if the plant isn't operating to its best capabilities. Who is to help all those people? Because it was Trump who said, don't sell your house to people in Ohio, and now they're screwed.
Eventually, the public is going to force solutions here because leaders are much more polarized than the general public. There are many members of the public who are still moderate and centrist in their orientations. Less than 5% of the U.S. Congress is a moderate today.
But you have this stubborn, static 35% that goes up and down by a few points that they don't want to get anything done. They hired him to blow the place up. And I think we all thought in 2016 that meant blow it up and build it up, replace it. That's not what's happening. It's the blowing up for the sheer sake of blowing up. And that's not going to work. And frankly, a year from now, the four of us are here. And we're telling the truth. We're trying really hard. People are watching. If one of us tells the truth, we're going to read about it online. If you are Donald Trump and there are no consequences to lying, it's going to take out one of the most important underpinnings of next year. Because in 2016, people could look at him and say, well, he's a blowhard, he's a showman, but he'll get okay when he's in office, and he's a businessman. But if he lies and he says, oh, everything's already great. The people in Michigan, the people in Minnesota, the people in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, who it's not gotten great for, but he just flat out lies and says your life has never been better. It's very tough for people like you and the rest of your industry to hold him accountable. It's near impossible.
Well, the truth matters and decency matters, and we have to deliver it every single day. Darrell, this is a great book. I highly recommend it. The book is Divided Politics, Divided Nation. Philippe, Michael, thank you both very much.
I bought it.
We are still watching as the House Judiciary debates the issue of subpoenas for the Mueller investigation. We're going to bring you any and all updates as we get them. Right now, no surprise, these men and women are talking.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.